Children come and go in this hospital. The following scenes show some of the most common accidents that happen to kids. Because they did first and thought last, they ended up in an ambulance like the one here. And here are some facts not very many people know. More children are crippled or killed by accidents in their home or neighborhood than all the diseases like polio, TB, and heart trouble put together. Tell that to your mom and dad tonight. They'll really be surprised. For instance, we know that every boy and girl should know how to swim. Uh-oh, that girl wants to have some fun. Looks like she's telling her friend to jump on Johnny when he comes up from dive. Yep, that's what she told him to do, all right. That's a good trick. It worked out just like she planned. Wait a minute, something's wrong with Johnny. Of course, tricks don't always turn out as we think they will. Like this one, for instance. Lucky for Johnny that Pete knew enough to drag him out of the pool and give him artificial respiration at once. Had they waited until they got to the hospital to do it, like this poor boy, it would have been too late. The trick almost had an unhappy ending. Another bad thing to fool around with is fire, as you all know. A campfire can be a lot of fun, but it can also be very dangerous. But Bill just isn't thinking about danger. It sure makes you mad when you try and still can't get a blaze started. It seems that David here has a good idea. Probably some more matches. Although if he hasn't started it by now, if that's gas in that can, he's going to be awfully sorry. Maybe one of his pals will stop him from throwing that gas on the fire. No one said a word. They're too busy concentrating on the fire to think about what might happen. And did happen. So, another bad accident. It doesn't always take gasoline to make fire dangerous. With know-how, you can burn fires. With carelessness, fires will burn you. Here's another cause for accidents happening while you're playing. For instance, this looks simple, doesn't it? And it was, until one of the boys decided to jump. Whoops, there he goes. He still seems to be in one piece. He said it was easy, nothing to it. Tells his friend to jump. But this boy isn't so sure. Come on, Mike, don't be afraid. Jump. It's not high. So Mike, not wanting to appear afraid, takes a deep breath and jumps. Unfortunately, he landed the wrong way. His friend is very sorry, but being sorry won't mend a broken leg. So the hospital gets another patient. Jumping from high places isn't smart, and pushing somebody when he doesn't expect it can be very dangerous. Walking on picket fences, climbing around old buildings may be fun, but it can also put boys and girls in the hospital, and that isn't so much fun. Here's something else to look out for. Playing in the streets. Ball games are fun, but they should also be safe. That's what playgrounds and schoolyards are for. For if he keeps his eye on the ball, he can't look out for traffic too. Neither a friend's warning nor the car's brakes prevented an accident or saved this boy. And again, the ambulance brings in the victim of an accident that never should have happened. Bob and Ed went canoeing at the lake one afternoon. It was a lovely day, peaceful and quiet, perfect for boating. Too quiet for Ed, I guess, because all of a sudden, he shouted to Bob to look at something on the shore. Bob did something no one should ever do, stand up in a canoe. This gave Ed a chance to start rocking the canoe and scare poor Bob. But once again, what started out as an innocent joke ended up in something more serious. It's a good thing Ed remembered what he'd learned in the Boy Scouts and threw Bob a safety seat in time to prevent a drowning. Guns cause some of the worst accidents and the most tragic, blindness. Such a gun is not only illegal for boys in most cities, but is a possible killer and crippler in their hands. He's a good shot, but look what happened. It's very easy to put out an eye with a BB gun or with pieces of flying glass, as happened in this case. Is it worth this, boys and girls? Supposing this were you. Just getting a half look at the world because someone didn't know how to use a gun safely. Now take the case of this young lady, cutting out paper dolls in the safety of her own home. Doesn't seem possible an accident could happen here, does it? When she heard her father at the door, she got excited. She'd just have time to hide behind the door and surprise him, like she did every night. She jumped to her feet. This time it was different. She tripped and fell on the scissors. And the doctor has another patch-up job to do. It's always dangerous to run with scissors or any other sharp, pointed object in the hand. It's also dangerous to climb on anything while holding scissors. If you fell, you could cut yourself or poke out an eye. Now, how could anything possibly happen to these boys? Let's go out to...
Hey, fellas, watch this. Yay! In Acapulco, we did it with water. Ooh, my watch.
And comes back with the best friend a kid could have when trouble occurs, a policeman. The officer goes into action fast. And the job of rescue begins. That's another thing to remember, boys and girls. Whenever you get into real trouble, go to your nearest police officer or sheriff. You'll find him a real friend in need. See how the officer questions Nick, to make sure he's not hurt any place but his wrist before he carries him up the rope. He's learned his lesson and was lucky not to have been hurt more than he was. You youngsters can save yourselves a lot of pain if you just stop and think. Listen to the advice of your parents and teachers. A hospital bed isn't anywhere near as nice as your bed at home. A bone that is broken in too many places may keep you from ever playing ball again. Maybe figures don't mean much to you, but listen, try to understand, because it's your life I'm talking about. More than 12,500 kids every year. More than 50,000 of them are permanently crippled every year. More than 1,500,000 children are seriously injured every year. And all of these accidents happen in your own home, your own neighborhood. So be careful, kids. Too many youngsters end up in the hospital. Why don't you stay out of it? Live and learn, because you are the America of tomorrow.
Dr. Robbins, emergency. Dr. Robbins, Dr. Robbins, Dr. Robbins.
Well, is she going to make it, Doctor?
Hello, Jerry. Well, how's the world's greatest newspaper man this morning?
Oh, okay, Doctor. I'm still looking for news. Say about the youngster. Is she going to be all right?
Yes, Jerry. No tragic ending this time. This little girl's going to get well. Thanks to Dr. Hartley here.
Well, you're too generous, Doctor. Well, the real life-saving was done before she got to the hospital.
Well, I don't get it, Doctor. What's the story?
Here's what I mean, Jerry. The real hero is somebody whose name you and I will never know. The good Samaritan that gave that little girl first aid at the scene of the accident.
Yes, Jerry. That person was one in 1,000.
Oh, but people always try to help. That is, most of them do. Now, you can't expect...
Yes, I know, Jerry. Most people are willing to help. But that alone isn't enough. It takes something more than just willingness to save a life.
Well, after all, we can't all be doctors.
Well, you don't have to be. But if everyone who is willing to help in an accident or emergency were armed with just a little, well, just the bare basic essentials of first aid, a great many lives would be saved. If everyone, if you, and you, and you, and you, would take the time to learn what to do before the doctor arrives. Know what to look for, know what to do, know how to do it. These are the essentials of first aid. Now let's see how these principles apply. First, in regard to wounds. A sharp-edged knife, a broken bottle, a sharp piece of metal, shattered windshield. These are but a few of the causes of wounds. Wounds that bleed. Bleeding can be fatal, but it can be stopped effectively with simple first aid treatment. There are two main types of bleeding that can occur: bleeding from arteries and bleeding from veins. To recognize each type, you should know how the blood circulates in the body. The heart acts as a pumping station. The right side of the heart pumps blood to the lungs. In the lungs, the blood picks up oxygen, which is necessary to sustain life. The blood then returns to the left side of the heart, where it is pumped to all parts of the body through a system of tubes known as arteries. Then through a network of tiny blood vessels called capillaries, and back again to the heart through another system of vessels, the veins. When one of the arteries is cut, bleeding is serious. Have you ever seen the way water spurts from a hand pump? Well, that is the way blood spurts from an artery which has been cut. Blood spurts with force from the wound each time the heart beats. This type of bleeding must be stopped quickly to save life. In most cases, bleeding can be stopped effectively by simple first aid measures, such as pressure applied directly on the wound. If this does not stop the bleeding, apply finger pressure, sometimes called digital pressure, between the heart and the wound. Another way is to use a tourniquet, similarly placed. Both methods compress and close off the artery. In all cases of serious bleeding, be sure to call the doctor. To return to digital pressure, there are several points on each side of the body where the arteries lie close to a bone. It's at these points where pressure is most effective. Arterial bleeding can be controlled on the scalp and on the upper portion of the head by finger pressure just in front of the middle portion of the ear. This stops the escape of blood from the artery serving this particular area. Blood flowing from a cut artery in the lower portion of the face may be controlled by pressure on the underside of the jawbone, just in front of the angle of the jaw. This cuts off the supply of blood to this portion of the face. Arterial bleeding from the neck can be controlled by pressure on the bleeding side of the neck. Anchor the thumb against the nape of the neck and, with the fingers, press alongside the windpipe toward the spinal column. Care must be taken not to press against the windpipe. For bleeding around the shoulder or armpit, bend the head slightly toward the bleeding side and bring firm pressure to bear with the thumb behind the center of the collarbone. The flow through this artery will thus be effectively controlled. Arterial bleeding of the arm at any point below the armpit may be controlled by pressure on the blood vessel against the bone of the upper arm, thus compressing the artery and checking the flow of blood. If an artery is cut in the leg or thigh, bleeding may be stopped by pressing firmly against the thigh bone high up on the inner side of the thigh, thus shutting off the blood supply to the limb below this point. When bleeding from the arm or leg cannot be controlled by digital pressure, use a tourniquet. A triangular bandage folded into a cravat makes an excellent tourniquet, as does a roller bandage. Stocking, large handkerchief, even a necktie will do if nothing else is available. But never use anything such as a wire or rope, which may cut into the skin and cause injury. When using a tourniquet, direct pressure on the artery is desirable. A small roll of bandage or folded gauze is excellent for this purpose. Never use anything hard or with sharp edges. Better to apply the tourniquet without a pad at all. Tuck the roll of bandage or pad directly over the artery. Wrap whatever material you are using for a tourniquet around the limb twice. Tie a loose knot. Place a short stick over this knot. Tie it securely in place. Now turn the stick so that the tourniquet tightens. Twist the stick only enough to stop the bleeding. This causes the pad to press firmly against the artery, forming a barrier past which the blood cannot flow. A tourniquet must be loosened at regular intervals of 15 minutes to avoid permanent damage to the tissues. If bleeding starts again, tighten the tourniquet. Remember to loosen the tourniquet every 15 minutes and tighten it again only if bleeding resumes. A condition known as shock may be present in all injuries and very frequently in severe bleeding. The vital functions of the body are slowed down. Shock may result in death. Therefore, while waiting for the doctor, treat the victim for shock immediately after stopping the bleeding. A person in shock is pale, has a cold, clammy skin, weak, rapid pulse, and breathes irregularly. Keep him quiet, lying down. Warm him. Wrap him completely in blankets or a coat or anything to keep him warm. Apply hot water bottles, carefully wrapped, bags of heated sand or salt. Take care, though, that you don't overdo it and burn the injured. Another thing to remember in treating shock is position. Keep the body flat and raise the foot of the bed, cot, or stretcher so the head is lower than the rest of the body. If the injured is lying on something that cannot be raised, keep his feet, legs, and thighs raised. Keep him lying quietly, and unless he coughs up blood or has difficulty in breathing or has nosebleed, don't allow him to sit up. At this point, stimulants are important. One of the most effective is aromatic spirits of ammonia. 1 teaspoonful in 1/2 glass of water. Hot coffee or tea also are excellent stimulants and are valuable in supplying heat. If he is unconscious, never try to force him to drink. An unconscious person may be revived by using a stimulant which can be inhaled, such as ammonia inhalant or aromatic spirits of ammonia on a handkerchief. Simply hold the handkerchief near the nose for a few seconds, or use smelling salts. Shock may be avoided if these steps are taken in time. So, those are the important things for you to do for a person suffering from shock. Keep him warm, keep him lying quietly on his back with his head lower than his feet, and give him stimulants. Well, these things sound simple, and they are. But these simple first aid steps, taken before the doctor comes, have saved many lives. And now let's go back and take up the second type of bleeding, a wound in which a vein is cut. Here's the circulatory system again. You have seen how the heart pumps blood through the arteries to all parts of the body. However, on the return trip, the blood flows back to the heart through the other set of vessels, the veins. Remember how an arterial wound bleeds? Spurting with a lot of pressure behind it. A wound in which a vein is cut bleeds quite differently. Blood escapes in a slow, steady stream, and with much less force. The best way to stop this type of bleeding is by direct pressure on the bleeding point with a sterile dressing. Dressings are usually made of gauze and are available in various sizes so that any wound, large or small, can be completely covered. Because they come in direct contact with the wound, dressings should be sterile, that is, free of bacteria. Sterile compresses are available in sealed, dust-proof packages to prevent contamination. The compress is placed directly over the wound and should be large enough to cover the entire wound. The bandage is applied to hold the compress in place. There are a variety of bandages suitable for all parts of the body. A very useful bandage for first aid work is the triangular bandage, which is merely a 36 or 40-inch square of cloth folded into a triangle or cut diagonally into two triangles. This can be used to hold a compress in place on the head, scalp, or face. To hold large dressings in place, as for example, on the chest. To place over injuries of the hand or foot. To bandage the shoulder and upper arm. When folded as a cravat, it can be used to tie splints in place. It can also be used as an arm sling, and of course as a tourniquet. Do not apply a triangular bandage directly over a wound. Many times a roller bandage may be used where a triangular bandage is not available. This type of bandage can be used to hold a sterile compress or dressing in place, to hold splints in place, as a sling for the arm, and as a tourniquet. Likewise, the roller bandage may be used in injuries to the arm, to bandage an injured hand, in wounds of the leg, the ankle, or foot, to bandage the shoulder and chest, and in wounds of the head. When using a roller bandage, hold it this way, and don't allow much of it to unroll at one time. In this manner, you will always have control of it. Always keep in mind that any bandage should be applied firmly enough to keep the compress in place, yet not so tight that it tends to stop the circulation of the blood. For minor wounds, the adhesive compress bandage proves very convenient and has many uses. Be sure to remove the protective covering from the adhesive ends and do not touch the sterile gauze pad with the fingers. Other types of injuries which also require dressings and sometimes bandaging. Among these are burns, searing steam, boiling water, fire, a hot stove. These are a few of the familiar causes of painful burns and scalds. In the case of burns, there are several important things to do. Treat for shock, dress the burn, and call for a doctor. In severe burns, after treating for shock, remove all loose clothing over the burn. If any of the clothing sticks to the burned skin, cut around it, but don't tear it off. Get medical attention at once. If ordinary baking soda or bicarbonate of soda is available, make a solution or a paste with tepid water. If there is some water which has already been boiled, use that. Apply the solution or paste gently over a burn. Bandage very lightly and carefully. If baking soda or any other approved burn preparation is not available, cover burns with a sterile dressing. Bandage lightly and wait for the doctor. Here are just a few don'ts. Try not to break open a blister. And don't apply to a burn cotton, iodine, oils, or greases. But first aid treatment isn't limited to dressing a wound or a burn or stopping the flow of blood. A person who knows first aid can be of help in cases of unconsciousness. An overturned canoe, a running engine behind closed garage door, a hissing gas jet, a live electric wire. These tell what to look for. Now, if in such cases breathing has stopped, the person may die. But given artificial respiration immediately, his breathing may be restored and his life saved. To discover whether the victim in such cases has stopped breathing, or if breathing is not readily apparent, place your hand on the victim's diaphragm. If breathing has stopped or is ineffective, his life may be saved if he is given artificial respiration immediately. Turn the victim so that he lies on his stomach. Grasp the hand on the side nearest you and extend the arm above the victim's head. Then grasp his other hand and pull toward you so that the victim rolls over. As he rolls, back around above his head. Bend his elbows and place his hands one upon the other under his head. His face should be turned to one side, cheek on hands, so that the nose and mouth are free for breathing. The victim's head should be extended, not dropped forward. The chin should be level, not sagging. In this position, the respiratory passages are not obstructed. The body should be slightly inclined in such a way that fluid will drain easily from the respiratory passages. The line shows the approximate inclination. Begin artificial respiration the moment the victim is in position. In the newest recommended method of artificial respiration, known as the Holger-Nielsen or back pressure arm lift method, seconds count just as they do in other methods. Do not delay to loosen clothing unless you have help. And do not take time to check the mouth until after the first expiration phase. If you have someone to help you, have him arrange the victim's head and make sure the mouth is clear and unobstructed while you begin respiration. Dental plates or any substances which might restrict breathing should be removed. If the tongue has fallen backward, it should be pulled forward. The mouth should be checked frequently during respiration. Now, here is the proper way to apply the back pressure arm lift method of artificial respiration. Kneel on either the right or the left knee at the head of the victim, facing him. Your knee should be at the side of the victim's head, close to his forearm. The opposite foot should be near the elbow of his other arm. Or you may kneel on both knees, placing one knee on each side of the victim's head, if you find it more comfortable to do so. Now place your hands flat on the victim's back so that the heels of your hands lie just below a line running between the armpits. Have the tips of your thumbs just touching and spread your fingers outward and downward. Now for the compression phase of respiration. Rock forward until your arms are approximately vertical, allowing the weight of the upper part of your body to exert slow, steady, even pressure downward upon your hands. Now this forces the air out of the lungs. Now keep your elbows straight and exert pressure almost directly downward on the back. The amount of pressure exerted depends upon the size of the victim. You wouldn't exert as much pressure on a child as you would on an adult. Now, release the pressure, avoiding a final thrust, and begin to rock slowly backward. Now, this is the back pressure or expiration part. This requires just about 2 seconds. Now, the arm lift or inspiration part. Place your hands upon the victim's arms just above his elbows and draw his arms upward and toward you, applying just enough lift to feel resistance and tension at the victim's shoulders. Do not bend your elbows, and as you rock backward, the victim's arms will be drawn toward you. The arm lift expands the chest and allows air to enter the lungs. Now, this also takes just about 2 seconds. Then drop the victim's arms to the ground. This completes the full cycle. After you have started artificial respiration, have someone wrap the victim in a blanket or other warm covering. The back pressure arm lift movements require about 5 seconds. Repeat the cycle 12 times a minute at a steady, uniform rate of compression and expansion. Press down, release arm, lift, 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 press down, release arm, lift. The back pressure arm lift method, first described by Holger Nielsen, causes a greater exchange of air than other comparable methods of artificial respiration, and it can easily be applied by a light individual upon a heavy adult. In addition, it is less tiring than other methods. When you become tired, have someone else take over, if possible. The change should be made at a prearranged expansion stroke without changing rhythm. One operator moves quickly away, and the relief operator moves into position and continues with the expansion stroke. In some cases, it is well worthwhile to continue the treatment for several hours before giving up hope. Watch the victim carefully when his natural breathing returns. He may stop breathing again. When this happens, resume artificial respiration immediately. Treat the victim for shock as soon as possible, and when he is breathing normally and fully conscious, give him warm fluids and keep him lying quietly until a doctor arrives. Remember, in giving first aid to a person whose breathing has stopped, start artificial respiration promptly. And also remember that if the victim has a broken arm, the Schaefer method can be used. Now, let's review the Holger Nielsen method. Place the victim on his stomach in a slightly inclined position, bend his elbows, place his hands one on the other, turn his face to one side, cheek resting on hand. Kneel at the head of the victim, facing him, on either knee or both if you prefer. Place your hands flat on the victim's back, just below a line running between his armpits. Have fingers spread outward and downward. Rock forward, press down, release. Rock backward, drawing the arms upward and toward you, then drop them. Repeat this movement 12 times a minute at a steady, uniform rate until breathing returns. Call for a doctor and for an inhalator if available. And now we come to fractures, broken bone, a rickety or broken stepladder, a carelessly placed toy, a bit of torn carpeting, stepping between parked cars. These are but a few of the causes resulting in fractures of bones. When a bone is broken, it may be either a simple or a compound fracture. Now here's the difference. Here's an x-ray of a simple fracture. The bone is broken, but the skin has not been pierced. The area around the broken bone is usually quite tender and painful. Within a short time, it'll become discolored and swollen. Now, here is an X-ray of a compound fracture, more serious than a simple fracture. There is a connecting wound to the surface in the immediate vicinity of the break. Bleeding may be severe. A tourniquet may be needed. When you suspect a fracture, call the doctor immediately. Then treat the victim for shock and make him comfortable. And finally, if he must be moved, or if a doctor isn't available, apply a splint. If it's a compound fracture, stop any bleeding and dress the wound and apply a splint as in simple fracture. The purpose of a splint is to hold the limb in a rigid position and prevent movement which might aggravate the injury. An effective splint is the so-called fixed traction type. A tourniquet is often placed around the injured member to be ready for use if bleeding occurs. For emergency purposes, in the absence of a traction splint, a board, a roll of newspapers, pillow, or an umbrella may serve as a splint. Regardless of the material used for splinting, it should extend beyond the joints, above and below the fracture. If possible, it should also be wide enough to give adequate support. Tie the splints securely, but not so tight as to stop circulation of the blood. Examine the injured part frequently, say every 15 minutes. If the injured part becomes too painful or circulation is being cut off, loosen the ties around the splint. Many times there is need of moving an injured person, either because the doctor isn't available or because of the location of the accident. For instance, in the case of a victim who has a fractured forearm, the transportation problem is relatively simple. The forearm should be splinted before the victim is moved. However, the transportation of a victim with a more serious fracture presents a greater problem. In fact, the victim should not be moved unless absolutely necessary or under the advice of the doctor. How many times have you read of a well-meaning motorist lifting an injured child from the street the very way the kind motorist lifted the child, jackknifing the child into his car? May have caused broken ribs to act as jagged spears, which might easily puncture the internal organs. Whenever there is a fracture of the lower limbs or other serious fractures, follow these simple rules. Only after a splint has been applied, use a stretcher. A door or a wide board will do if a stretcher isn't available. Place the victim carefully onto the stretcher, taking great care not to twist or jar the body. Keep him lying flat. When carrying the stretcher, avoid unnecessary jarring or swinging, which might aggravate the injury. Remember, an injured person is at your mercy. Treat him as gently and as kindly as you would like to be treated. Well, you have seen some of the essentials of first aid. Now, this doesn't make a doctor of you, nor a first aid expert. But a knowledge of first aid should enable you, with practice, to relieve suffering and perhaps save a life. Now, when your opportunity will come, or where it'll be, nobody knows. But your help may be wanted, may be needed at any time. If you have not already done so, enroll for a first aid course and learn how to use your equipment properly. Always always keep in mind these simple but important rules to follow before the doctor arrives. Know what to look for. Know what to do. Know how to do it. And when you call a doctor, don't forget to give him some details as to the nature, seriousness of the injury. And if you want to be a really good Samaritan, it's generally a pretty good idea to let the doctor know just where the injured person is.
Dr. Davidson, emergency room. Dr. Davidson, emergency room.
He won't be awake for an hour or so, and I'll be back by then. Might be a good idea if you'd look in on him.
Yes, doctor.
It didn't work this time, did it, Dick? Oh, I know you've crossed against the red light a lot of times before, and have been pretty lucky at it. But you can't be lucky forever. Sometimes things go wrong. That's why you're here. Who are you? You ought to know me by now. I've been trying to keep you out of trouble all my life. And your name? I'm known as Good Judgment, but call me Judge. For a minute, I thought you were going to take my advice at that intersection and wait for the beginning of the green light. But it seems you were in too much of a hurry to make that ball game to bother thinking about good judgment. Good judgment? Phooey. Why don't you leave Dick alone? He doesn't need a babysitter. You and your advice. Look both ways. Wait for the green light. Don't play in the street. Ah, kid stuff. Dick's old enough to take care of himself. You think he's an idiot or something? He would be if he listened to you, and it's a cinch your advice hasn't exactly helped him. Who's this fellow? Oh, that's Bad Impulse. Imp for short. He's the character who told you it was okay to cross against the red light. You see what happens when you listen to him? That's a lie. If a guy did all the things some people think he ought to do, he wouldn't have any fun at all. And another thing, If you hadn't confused him with all that safety hokum, he could have dodged that car easy. Look, if he would have stayed on the curb, he wouldn't have had to dodge anything. Okay, so he had a tough break. These things just happen. They just happen? That's exactly what Officer Davis was talking about when he came out to your school the other day. Remember?
And now...
Remember?
And now, here are just 3 simple rules that will help you be safe. 1, look both ways before crossing a street. 2, watch for turning cars. And remember that the driver of a turning car can't always see you. 3, always remember to walk on the left side of the highway facing the traffic. In that way, you can see the oncoming cars. Accidents do not just happen. People make them happen because they take chances and because they violate the law that was made for their protection. Be careful, and you'll not only help yourself, but you'll also help the driver behind the wheel. He has a job just driving his automobile without worrying about pedestrians crossing in the middle of the block or against red lights. Now you see this line? The first part represents the reaction time, or thinking distance. That is the distance the automobile will travel before the driver can get his foot on the brake. The rest of the line shows how much farther the car will travel before it comes to a stop. If a car is traveling 20 miles an hour, it takes the driver 45 feet to stop, after he knows he must stop. Now this line indicates the distance it takes to stop an automobile going 30 miles an hour. The first part shows the reaction time of the driver, while the second part shows how much further it takes to stop the automobile, making a total stopping distance of 78 feet at that speed. That's why you're asking for trouble when you take chances at an intersection, or when you try to cross the street in the middle of the block, or when you play in the streets.
Oh, come on now, Dick. That's 3rd grade stuff. That accident you were in was the driver's fault. He could have stopped in plenty of time if he was any kind of a driver. They ought to take his license away. I'd say the driver did everything he could to stop. Don't you think so, Dick? Get a load of this guy. Some friend is Judge, trying to blame everything on you. Why, if I were you, I'd... Now, just a minute. Judge is right. Oh, let's forget the whole thing. It's not that important. Not important? Are you kidding? It's something everybody should know about and remember and do. Da-da-da, da-da. Oh, listen to that guy talk. One more crack like that and I'm going to come over there and break one of your legs. A lot of other guys are going to be in trouble, too, if they try to beat the red light or if they play out in the middle of the street. So what's wrong with playing in the street? These kids can take care of themselves. What do you want them to do? Sit home and play patty cake? It's true they're big enough to take care of themselves, and that's something pretty important. But it certainly isn't very smart to play out in the middle of the street or to take unnecessary chances, especially around traffic. The guy or girl who takes the chance is gambling with his own life. He makes things difficult for automobile drivers, no matter how careful they try to be. You see, it just isn't good sportsmanship to play in the street where drivers have to stop for you. It's a lot more fun to play where you can concentrate on the game, and it's much safer. So let's all sit home and cut out paper dolls. That's a real bright remark, Imp. Just about your speed, all right. And I suppose you know just the right thing to do? You bet I do. All kids like Dick have to do is use a little common sense, and their chances of growing up to play on bigger teams someday are a lot better. You know, I never thought of that. I wonder if I'll ever be able to play ball again. What if I can't? What if I can't ever walk again? Oh, I just gotta. Now take it easy, Dick. That's the trouble with listening to Bad Impulse. When you listen to that guy, there's a lot of things you don't think of until it's too late. Now, hold on, Dick. Don't let him get you all mixed up. We've had a lot of fun together. And look where I am now. Well, that's the trouble when you take chances in traffic. Sooner or later, your luck runs out. Kids take chances every day and get away with them. Who wants to wait all day for a light to change to green before starting across the street? Why walk down to an intersection just to get to the other side? Why go to a playground when there's plenty of room in the street? Signal set, 2, 4, 6, hike. You know, you just have to be on your toes, that's all. After all, what do cars have brakes for? Yes, and all you have to do is just slip once. And I don't think it's worth it. Neither do I, Judge. No, sir. I think everyone who has gotten past the first few grades knows the safe thing to do around traffic. Yes, Judge, we know them, but a lot of times we ignore them, the way I did. They're easy enough to remember if you really want to. Always wait for the beginning of the green light before crossing a street. Cross only at intersections and stay in the marked zones if there are any. Never cross between intersections or come out from behind parked cars. Play where you don't have to worry about jumping out of the way of automobiles. If you have to walk along the edge of a road, walk facing traffic. And at night, wear something white so you can be seen more easily. Well, Dick, I hope that you and I can stick more closely together after this. Don't listen to him, Dick. Now Judge is right. You don't care what happens to Dick, do you? All you try to do is take the fun out of life. No, I just try to protect people. Who needs to be protected? Who needs to be hurt?
Well, young fella, you must have been having some dream.
Dream? Yeah. Now I remember. The accident. I guess I'm hurt pretty bad. Doctor, will I be able to run and play ball again?
We'll talk about that later.
Doctor, I had the craziest dream. It was about Judge and Imp. Judge was right all along.
Well, you just better take it easy, son.
I will from now on. Especially now that Judge and I understand each other.
Judge?
Sure. Judge is my pal. Good judgment.
When you are working in your class, do you sometimes forget some of the safe ways to do things to keep from getting hurt? Well, today in Miss Johnson's room, they've decided to play a safety game that will help everyone think of safe ways to do things in school. And all of us who are watching can play with them. Today, it's Bill's turn to be the safety guide. The safety guide is going to watch the things the class does. When he sees a good, safe way, he'll give it the go sign, just like a traffic light. And he'll raise the stop sign when he sees a way that is not safe. If Bill doesn't see it, someone else will. Now he's watching a group at work, and all the rest of us are watching their safety practices. Look closely now. Bill sees something. Did anyone else see it? What was it, the safe? Yes, Richard passed the scissors handle first. That's the right way, the safe way, isn't it? And all of us want to learn to know good, safe ways to keep everyone from getting hurt. Now, let's keep watching. Do you see something? Do you suppose June was trying to catch the safety guide? What's the safe way to carry pencils and other sharp things? Yes, with the point down. Miss Johnson has a picture that shows how someone might get hurt by not following good, safe ways. Do you see what can happen to someone who carries his pencil with the point up? Let's all remember the right way. Carry sharp things with the point down. All right. Let's keep watching as the group goes on working. Who will be the first to see a good or a bad safety practice? Do you see something? Doris sees it, but the safety guide doesn't. Miss Johnson wants Doris to show what it is. When you carry a chair that way, the legs might hurt someone. What's a good way to carry a chair? This way, points down, the way we carry pencils. The class beat the safety guide that time. Bill will have to look sharp, won't he? Are you watching the way the class is watching? And Bill is watching? Let's see if you are. Uh-oh. Do you see what the safety guide sees? Does Marilyn see her own bad safety habit? Yes, keeping all 4 chair legs on the floor is the safe way. It would keep this fellow from getting hurt, wouldn't it? So everyone will keep his chair right square on the floor. Do you see what the safety guide sees? What Ellen sees? Gordon needs to remember to keep his feet out of the way so they won't trip other people. We all need to remember that. Well, now it's time for recess. But because of rainy weather, they will go to the gym today. But it seems that some forgot to keep thinking about good, safe ways to do things. If everyone takes his turn getting his gym shoes, without crowding and shoving, they will all get to recess sooner and more safely, won't they? Now, Clark has a question for Miss Johnson. Is it good safety to walk around with a shoelace dangling? No, it is not. Bill's going to watch that from now on. And we can watch for more safety practices on the way to the gym. Now watch. Did you see what Bill saw? Why did he give the stop sign? What would happen to Roy's fingers if that door closed all the way? It's good safety always to use the doorknob so your fingers don't get caught in the door. I see a good, safe way. Do you? The safety guide sees it too. Everyone knows about walking on the right side of the hall, so we don't bump into people coming the other way. But should we walk this close to the wall? The safety guide thinks not. Here's why. It's a good idea to keep to the right, but leave enough room for doors to be opened without hurting anyone. What about safety on the stairs? It's a good practice to hold onto the handrail to keep from getting hurt if you should slip. And to walk, not jump or run. These are good, safe ways. Do you remember the others we've seen? How do we pass the scissors? That's right, handle first. How do we carry pencils or sharp points? We carry them point down. How do we carry chairs? Yes, with the legs pointed down. How do we sit on a chair? We keep our chair legs on the floor, all four of them. And we keep our own legs out of the way so no one trips over them. When we go somewhere or do something together, do we push or shove? No, we wait for our turn without crowding or hurrying. What about fingers on the edge of a door? It's safer to use the doorknob. Do we keep to the right? Yes, but we leave enough room so doors can open without hurting anyone. We always walk on the stairs without jumping, and we hold on to the handrail. And there are other safe practices you may know and would like to think about. Maybe you would like to play a safety game in your school and have more fun, too.
Any severely injured person will develop shock. Shock comes principally because of a depression of circulation and an eventual fall in blood pressure. As the shock deepens, the pulse increases in speed and becomes weaker. Irregular breathing and cold, moist skin are symptoms of shock. If the patient is lying on a cold or a damp floor or the ground, put woolen or some other material under him. First aid for shock is to conserve the body heat of the patient and keep him warm but not hot. Use great care not to move the patient unnecessarily. Notice how the blanket is pulled against the long axis of the victim's body. Do not use heated objects to warm a person who is suffering from shock. His sensations are not normal and it is easy to burn him. Always have someone call a doctor. When serious shock seems probable, raise the lower extremities several inches and maintain this elevation. Be reassuring and give your patient the impression that competent, sympathetic hands are doing all that can be done while awaiting the doctor. When bleeding from a wound is severe, elevate the wounded part of the body if possible. Do not touch the wound with the hand or unclean material. Think first of pressure. Use a thick layer of sterile gauze or a folded, freshly laundered handkerchief and apply firm pressure with your hand. Bandage the gauze in place. If this treatment does not stop the bleeding, then a tourniquet is necessary. Apply the tourniquet above the wound, allowing a reasonable skin area between it and the wound. Wrap the material twice around the limb and tie a half knot. Place a short stick or something similar on the half knot and tie a square knot over it. Twist the stick just enough to stop the flow of blood completely. Call a physician as soon as possible. And keep the victim quiet. These lines indicate the pathways of the arteries we need to consider in first aid. At 6 principal points, these main arteries lie close to the bones. These are the points where digital or finger pressure on the artery and against a bone may stop bleeding. These points are called pressure points. Occasionally, the application of digital or finger pressure at one of these pressure points is a helpful measure in case of hemorrhage. Here is the proper technique for applying pressure to each of these pressure points. Just in front of the ear against the skull. About an inch forward from the angle of the jaw, where a large branch crosses the jawbone. In the neck, at the side of the windpipe, against the backbone. Behind the inner end of the collarbone, down against the first rib. On the body side of the upper arm, halfway between the shoulder and elbow. In the mid-groin, where the artery passes over the pelvic bone. Remember, always apply the pressure between the injury and the heart for arterial bleeding. The first rule in artificial respiration is to start treatment immediately. To revive infants and small children, mouth-to-mouth artificial respiration is recommended. Tilt the head back to keep the air passage open. Take air in your mouth and force it into the victim's mouth until the chest rises. Then allow the lungs to empty. Be sure to cover the victim's mouth and nose with your mouth. Apply a continuous pressure to prevent the victim's stomach from filling with air. Repeat the cycle about 20 times a minute until normal breathing is restored. The mouth-to-mouth technique can be used effectively on persons of all ages. When used on an older victim, the chin must be held up and forward to keep the airway open, and the nose must be held closed. An alternate way to give artificial respiration is the back pressure arm lift method. Lay the victim on his stomach, bend his elbows, and place his hands one on the other. Keep his head upright placing his chin on his hands. Place the heels of your hands on an imaginary line running across the shoulders below the armpits. Your thumbs should just touch, and your fingers spread downward and outward. With arms held straight, swing forward slowly so that the weight of your body is gradually brought to bear on the victim. As you rock backwards, do not bend your elbows. Notice that the arm grasp is just above the elbow. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. Always summon a physician as soon as possible and treat for shock. Check the mouth for obstructions. Don't give up. Continue artificial respiration until natural breathing is restored. A fracture is a break in a bone. Where a fracture is suspected, call a doctor. While waiting for the doctor, splint and prepare the patient for transportation. Place the arm in a normal position. A magazine or newspaper will make a good improvised splint. Be sure it is long enough to extend beyond the joint above and below the fractured bone, and that it is as wide as the limb. Tie the splint securely, but not tight enough to cut off circulation of the blood. All extensive burns should be regarded as open wounds with shock and infection as hazards. The same general pattern should be applied to all burns. Give the victim this first aid treatment. Gently remove loose, protruding bits of clothing in the burn, being very careful not to touch the tissue. After the burn is well exposed, place the dry pad or dressing over the burn so that it covers the area completely. Then bandage the dressing into place. Do the best possible job when applying a dressing, because the tendency in medical practice today is to change dressings infrequently. Wrap the bandage smoothly and evenly. For complete information about first aid, enroll in an American Red Cross first aid class in your community.
However, when disaster strikes, you may not be able to obtain trained medical aid in time. There are many forms of disaster. They can happen to you and your family at any moment. This film is one of a series on medical self-help. Its purpose is to teach you what to do in an emergency situation when there is no doctor.
Within the human body, as we work, sleep, and play, an invisible life stream, a precious red fluid that sustains our health. But let's look more closely at this fluid and the way it circulates throughout the body. Area of the body, smaller arteries. Blood returns to the heart of vessels called veins. As a complex system, smaller veins lead to the great veins that go directly to the heart. there is also another network. Innumerable tiny, narrow, thin-walled vessels called capillaries, connecting the arteries through arterioles, to venules, to the veins. In sum, this is a complete network of vessels carrying oxygen and food to every part of the body, also fighting disease germs and helping to get rid of body wastes. To perform this work, the average-sized adult has about 6 quarts of blood in his body. A child, about half that amount. Were an adult to lose, in a short period of time, 1 quart of blood, a child 1 pint, life would be endangered. Fortunately, however, when we are injured, our blood has a unique characteristic, the ability to clot when bleeding occurs. This clotting process, aided by certain substances in our blood, coagulates or thickens the blood when it is exposed to air, and in a short time forms a plug that reduces further bleeding. Application of direct pressure over the wound helps to speed the clotting process. When only a vein is damaged, the blood flows somewhat slowly from a wound and, in most cases, can be controlled with relative ease. However, blood from an artery emerges from a wound in spurts and, if not quickly controlled, will soon result in shock. This is your cue to arterial bleeding, bright red blood gushing from a wound. In this case, a clean handkerchief will be used as a dressing. Applied over the wound along with direct pressure. In this emergency, with no first aid materials on hand, you decide to use your belt as a bandage to hold the dressing in place, as well as to maintain pressure. Blood from an arterial wound, however, soaks through the dressing. And additional dressing must be improvised. While care is taken to maintain direct pressure over the wound. Again, the dressings, absorbing the blood, will help coagulate or thicken it, and thus slow up bleeding. But what do you do in the most austere situation, when even the barest essentials for care of an arterial wound are unavailable? This flow of blood must be stemmed. If you can't find a clean cloth, there is a ready alternative. Use your bare hand. Remember, the important thing is to stop the bleeding as quickly as possible. Another accident situation where direct pressure and use of a dressing have failed to stop severe arterial bleeding of an arm wound. Here, another measure is called for. Pressure on the main blood vessel supplying this part of the body. In the arm, the brachial artery. In the leg, the femoral artery. By pressing the appropriate blood vessel against the underlying bone, you can lessen severe bleeding of an arm or leg wound. You'll find a brachial artery on the inner half of the arm, midway between the elbow and armpit. To locate the vessel, feel for its pulsation. Then apply pressure quickly and firmly. You can locate the pulse beat of the femoral artery on the front inner half of the thigh, where it joins the body. To help control bleeding, apply pressure with your fingers or the heel of your hand, compressing the artery against the underlying thigh bone. In this situation, direct pressure methods have failed to halt gushing of blood from a leg wound. You know that continued loss of blood may prove fatal to the victim. With a life ebbing away, then, and only then, is the time to employ a measure that is a last resort. Use of a tourniquet that may mean saving a life, but also later amputation of the limb, since its lack of blood supply may cause death of the tissue. However, saving a life is your choice over possible loss of a limb. To apply a tourniquet, use your belt, necktie, stocking, or a bandage. In fact, any flat material about 2 inches wide. Don't, however, use a wire, rope, cord, or any material that may injure underlying tissues and blood vessels. Place the tourniquet between the wound and the heart, also as low as possible above the wound. However, in the case of bleeding below the knee or below the elbow, the tourniquet should be placed above the joint. To protect the skin, put the tourniquet over a trouser leg, shirt sleeve, or other material. After making a loop around the limb, tie the ends together. With a strong stick inserted under the loop, begin tightening it, but only enough to stop the arterial bleeding. Remember, if the tourniquet is too loose, it will shut off only the venous return vessel, which will increase the bleeding of the wound. Secure the tourniquet in place by tying one end of the stick to the limb. That will keep it from slipping off. The wounded limb is extremely subject to cold injury, so try to provide it with some protection from the weather. Finally, bear in mind, a tourniquet is a measure only of last resort, to be applied when all direct pressure methods have failed, when with no other way of stopping blood gushing from a wound, life itself is at stake. Most external bleeding, however, can be controlled by application of direct pressure. Once the bleeding has stopped, a bandage should be used to hold the dressing in place. One not necessarily sterile, but as clean as possible. In this case, a roller bandage, one of 3 basic types of bandages, will be used to secure the dressing. Note how this type of bandage is applied, with the loose end held at the bottom as the roll is passed around the injured part. It is applied evenly and firmly, but not so tightly as to cut off the blood supply. The bandage should be anchored in place by splitting it to a length that will provide 2 ends, which are tied to prevent the bandage from tearing further. The ends are then wrapped in opposite directions around the limb and knotted with a square knot. Always check a bandage after a half hour or so to see that it hasn't reduced circulation. Note that in a leg wound, the toes should be left exposed. If they become blue or swollen, it means the bandage is too tight. So far, we've covered treatment for severe arterial bleeding, indicated by the gushing of bright red blood from a wound. But what about care for venous bleeding? Use the same principle of firm, direct pressure on the wound as you would in arterial bleeding. and continue this pressure from 5 to 10 minutes up to a half hour if necessary. Work carefully, taking your time. Remember, your own behavior will be reflected in the victim's reaction to your treatment. Bleeding has now slowed to a point where a bandage is required to secure the dressing. You can improvise a triangular bandage from muslin, sheeting, a blanket, or any other strong material. It is probably the most versatile of all bandages, for it can be folded in a variety of ways to fit almost any part of the body. Another use of the triangular bandage, forming it into a sling to support the injured limb. Note that the fingers are left exposed, so that if they become blue or swollen, over-tightness of the bandage will be indicated. Here, in another type of disaster situation, we come to a different kind of bleeding wound. When a limb is injured by a crushing force, there is surprisingly little bleeding, since the damaged edges are closed by pressure from the surrounding tissue. First, treat the victim for shock. Then, after applying a sterile or clean dressing to the wound, you'll need a bandage to secure it in place. Here, a four-tail bandage is prepared by splitting any type of clean material from each end. Such injuries often cause swelling, and the four-tail bandage is quick and easy to adjust. Another type of bleeding wound. Coughing up of bright red frothy blood that may contain air, pointing to a possible chest injury, especially in the presence of painful breathing and shock symptoms. Because part of the hemorrhage is beyond reach, direct pressure to control bleeding is not practical. But there are measures that can be taken to prevent air from being sucked in and blown out of the chest cavity through the wound. Note that as the injury allows incoming air into the chest cavity, the lung is compressed and collapses, making proper breathing impossible. In fact, you can hear air being sucked in and out, and you may also see bubbling of the blood from the wound. You must act quickly to make the chest wound airtight as soon as possible. As the victim exhales, apply a dressing large enough to stop the flow of air through the wound. With the dressing packed firmly over the wound, cover it, if possible, with a large piece of material, and bind this covering securely over the dressing. Have the victim lie on his injured side to permit the uninjured side to receive more air. If he wishes, however, let him sit up to ease his breathing, even though he may be in shock. Keep his head higher than his chest. In a disaster, there may be many kinds of bleeding wounds, ranging from minor cuts to severe abdominal, chest, and head wounds. For example, it may be an abrasion, easily infected because of the wide surface of tissue exposed. It may be an incision, a clean-cut wound that bleeds easily and is not so likely to become infected. Or a laceration, tearing away the skin and tissue, extremely susceptible to infection. Or a puncture wound, usually bleeding very little, but also highly susceptible to infection. General care of these and other types of wounds, after verifying that there is no severe hemorrhage requiring immediate action, includes stopping the bleeding and making sure the airways are clear. Treat for shock until the victim can be moved to a sheltered area. Once in the shelter, expose all injured areas. Remove clothing from a wound by tearing it away rather than pulling it over the wound. This lessens danger of infection. When, as in this case, the wound is minor, wash it with soap and water. Start from the edges and wash away from the wound in a circular motion. Then apply a sterile dressing and bandage, for no matter how small the injury, unless properly protected, germs may enter the wound and cause infection. On the other hand, if a wound with a small amount of bleeding cannot be bandaged properly, better leave it exposed rather than use a dirty dressing or bandage. The blood will shortly coagulate and form a protective seal over the wound. Now, the care of other wounds of the body which are in themselves serious or may point to complications even more serious than the surface wound. First, treatment for bleeding from the ear. An ear bleeding associated with an injury can mean a fractured skull. Do not wash the ear, because infection might be introduced into the brain. Simply apply 2 or 3 pads of gauze over the outside of the ear, taping them into place to prevent anything from entering the ear that might develop an infection. To a skull fracture, usually associated with an injury to the brain, a head wound may, as in this case, be merely a cut or bruised scalp. However, before applying a dressing to a scalp wound, always check the area of the wound to see if there is any indentation or cupping of the skull. To stop the flow of blood when there is no sign of a skull fracture, apply direct pressure gently to the wound, with the victim lying flat on his back. Once a dressing is applied, don't remove it for at least 1 week unless there are definite signs of infection. In that event, it will be necessary to change dressings daily. When there is no sign of infection, remove the dressing at the end of 1 week and clean the wound with soap and water before applying a new dressing. However, in this situation, the victim's head wounds have been dressed, pressure applied, yet bleeding has not been completely stopped. Place him in a sitting position for a short period until the decreased flow of blood can coagulate and stop the bleeding entirely. Stay close to the victim. Watch him carefully. He may be weak and dizzy. And provide support so he will not fall over and injure himself further. How can you tell if a scalp wound is associated with a skull fracture or brain injury? By one or more of these symptoms. Is she or has she recently been unconscious? Is blood or other fluid escaping from her nose and ears? Is her pulse slow? Has she a headache or convulsions? Are the pupils of her eyes of different size? Has she difficulty in rousing, or is she vomiting? If the answer to any of these questions is yes, suspect a skull fracture and/or a brain injury. In such a situation, apply a soft, sterile dressing to the wound without, repeat, without any pressure, even though bleeding may continue. Bear in mind, in case of a depressed fragment of skull bone or exposure of any brain substance, it is extremely dangerous to apply any pressure to the wound area. Just cover it lightly. Merely bandage the dressing in place, with the bandage only snug enough to keep it from slipping off. As in treatment for all head injuries, have her lie flat, with her head level or slightly raised, and keep her warm. During the first 24 hours, give her nothing to drink. If her temperature rises, use sponge baths of water or alcohol to bring it down. And always be sure to keep the airways clear. She must be kept warm, and both her pulse and breathing will require continuous observation. Next, treatment for neck and jaw wounds. Because of the many blood vessels present, bleeding from wounds of the neck is usually severe. To stop the bleeding, exert direct pressure with a sterile or clean dressing. Then, bind the dressing in place to protect the wound. If a large artery or vein is cut, apply hand pressure above and below the cut, maintaining this pressure until the bleeding has slowed. Don't be afraid of contaminating the wound with your hands. If the blood makes the neck slippery to grasp, use a folded cloth or a pad of clean material under your fingers. A victim of a neck wound may choke because of bleeding inside his throat. So have him sit up with his head held forward and down. Or preferably, have him lie face down. In a jaw wound, there is also usually severe bleeding along with the danger of choking on one's own blood. Apply direct pressure to stop the bleeding. Again, have the victim sit up with his head held forward and down. Such an injury should also be treated as a fracture, as the dressing is secured to protect the wound and support the fracture. Tie the bandage over the top of the head. Secure the bandage with a large bow knot, leaving the ends easily available, so that in the event of need for vomiting, he can rapidly loosen the bandage. Finally, injuries that can cause internal bleeding. For example, chest and abdominal wounds. In such a situation, there is little you can do other than have the injured person lie still while you keep him warm. If he's unconscious or only partly conscious and also coughing up blood, turn his head to one side to prevent the blood from choking him. Wipe the blood out of his mouth and throat if he can't spit it out. In an abdominal wound, the greatest danger is from infection. Actually, there is little you can do without proper medication and medical supplies. Though there is very little external bleeding, be sure not to apply pressure to control the bleeding. Simper the wound with a sterile or clean dressing and fasten it securely in place. Then treat the victim for shock. In this film, you have seen various types of bleeding wounds, as well as measures to be taken to halt the loss of the life-giving fluid, on which so many vital functions of the human body depend. Now, let's recap some of the major points in care and treatment of bleeding wounds. You can almost always control bleeding by direct pressure on the wound. If no broken bones are involved, elevating an injured leg or arm will help lessen the loss of blood from a wound. Compressing the main supplying vessel against the underlying bone can help in quick temporary control of bleeding. A tourniquet should be used only when all other methods to stop the loss of blood have failed and when someone's life is at stake. Be sure to bandage dressings firmly in place using a roller, triangular, or four-tail type bandage, as called for by the location and kind of wound. In caring for a bleeding wound, act calmly and confidently. Your own assurance can do much to reassure the victim of the wound. Finally, after the bleeding has been controlled, see that the injured person is warm and comfortable. If necessary, treat for shock. Remember, the human body can withstand only a certain loss of its precious life stream. In an emergency, with medical assistance unavailable, the skills you learn today may help you save a life tomorrow.
What does one under the influence of LSD hear, see, and do? We're about to take you into the world of the LSD user, a world that to him is real, yet as terrifying and unreal as anything ever imagined. We call his trip of terror to fly a giant bird.